Welcome tonight to this meeting in the Morris and Doris Blackburn room of the Coburg Library. We have a mixture of Coburg Historical Society members. We've got visitors from Merribeck Library users and friends, and we may even have some people that found the talk on the National Trust Victoria Heritage Festival list. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming out. I'm pretty sure that the talk will be well worth it. So this is our monthly meeting. Coburg Historical Society acknowledges and pays its respects to the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which our headquarters, the Bluestone Cottage at 82 Bell Street, Coburg, is built, and on which this meeting in the library and the talk is being held. We recognise their continuing connection to the land and the waters and our community. We pay our respects to their culture and their elders, past, present and future. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, who's Aidan. Already said that. So he actually created a website called Guide to Australian Bushrangers. So I think that's what you put in, do you? To get there. And he's been researching and writing since June 2017. Since then, he has also self-published several books, including Glenrowan, a novel based on historical accounts of the Kelly's gang last month, Aaron Sherritt, Persona Non Grata, a biography of one of the Kelly gang's closest supporters, who became their final victim, and Bushrangers Tales Volume 1, which is a collection of stories about some of the most notable Australian bushrangers. He's been interviewed on ABC Radio, Hobart Magazine, Storytown's podcast, and something really exotic, the French travel program, Invitation au Voyage. Adam's background is in education and the arts. When he's not researching bushranger history, he's usually travelling to schools all around Victoria, and soon it's going to be Tasmania as well, delivering presentations on violence prevention for the Pat Cronin Foundation. Aidan first turned up at a talk in June last year, and where Siobhan O'Neill and Nolene Lloyd talked about the Irish famine orphan girls. So we're very glad to welcome him back this time as a guest speaker about some of the bushrangers who have been prisoners at the Bluestone Cottage. The Bluestone College, not cottage, which of course is Pentridge Prison. So can we give Aidan a welcoming round of applause?
All right. Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. Let me just get my script up so I can make sure I'm getting it right. So thank you first of all to the Society for inviting me to come and talk to you all about the things I've been researching. We're going to be talking about some very fascinating figures that did some time at the Bluestone College. So for the sake of clarification, in case you weren't entirely sure, I am talking about the now defunct Pentridge Prison. And this was a name that was a colloquialism that was bestowed upon the prison due to the many hard lessons learned by its inmates. It was known as a school of hard knocks, if you will. So what we'll be looking at this evening is a little bit of history, but more specifically we'll be looking at its connection to some of Australia's most intriguing and infamous bushrangers. The bushrangers we'll be looking at may be somewhat familiar to you already, or they might be a complete mystery. Either way, hopefully you will learn something interesting. Now it seems only appropriate that we should begin where it all began for Pentridge. It began in the days when Victoria was still the lower portion of the colony of New South Wales. Pentridge was not always envisaged as a fearsome bluestone fortress to keep the undesirables away. Pentridge Stockade, as we can see up here, was established as a temporary measure in 1850 to combat overcrowding in establishments like the Melbourne Jail, as well as providing a base of operations for road gangs working on the road to Sydney. So the stockade in those early years comprised of a small collection of bluestone buildings that were built by the convicts to house the officers and their families. And there were a series of portable wooden cells to house the convicts outside of work hours. Samuel Barrow, a former magistrate of the penal settlement at Norfolk Island, was employed to oversee the operation. The stockade was named after the village it was established near, although the area would later be renamed Coburg to disconnect locals from the notorious reputation of the prison. As was to be expected, there was apprehension in the local community when news of the impending stockade was announced, and animosity towards the institution grew and continued through the duration of its use and even after it had been closed down over 100 years later. There are still people who would love to see it torn down completely. The stockade stretched over 43 acres, which would provide ample space for convicts to work in. Its proximity to useful deposits of bluestone meant that convicts could be employed quarrying and breaking rock that would be used in the creation of buildings and surfacing the roads. So, as mentioned previously, the original cells were portable wooden structures that were about as secure as you would think. Inmates slept on wooden benches and each cell was designed to house 20 inmates. The portability enabled gangs to be housed closer to where they were going to be working, but this benefit was soon to be dwarfed by the inherent security flaws in the design. So you can see in the illustration here, it was just a big wooden cubby house effectively, and it would be pulled by a bunch of workhorses to go from place to place. And this image here will give you a bit of an impression of what the area around the stockade looked like at the time. So as you can imagine, they would have been looking out over vast fields and throughout the quarries and going, there's not much here. Very different to how it looks now. So over the next 3 years, as Victoria's gold rush exploded, the population of convicts went from 50 to 200. At this time, Pentridge Stockade had sister establishments in Collingwood, Richmond and Williamstown, all of which no longer exist. It was also at this time that the government began to procure several ships that had been abandoned due to their crews joining the gold rush and converted them into prison holds to be anchored offshore in Hobson's Bay, Point Gellibrand, as another alternative prison. This brings us to our first bushranger, Francis Christie. Francis Christie was born in 1830 in Rossshire, Scotland, emigrating to Australia with his parents and 4 siblings in 1834. He grew up in New South Wales around Goulburn and then moved to Portland in what would later become the colony of Victoria. The turbulent life led young Frank to work as a stockman, which was one of the only available jobs for a young, able-bodied man like him at the time. It was through this line of work that he developed his love of horses, which then of course became an interest in horse stealing. In 1850, Frank decided to try his hand at duffing and was accompanied by John Stewart, alias William Troy, and John Newton. They went to Salisbury Plains Station at Loddon River, which was owned by William Lockhart Morton, inventor of the sheep dip. Here, on the 9th of June, they stole a mob of horses, the number of which was variously reported to have been composed somewhere between 21 to 37 animals. They moved the stolen animals to Mount Sturgeon with an intention to take them down to Portland for sale. And they joined in a local race meeting while they were there. That night, Christie wrote a letter to an auctioneer in Portland and stated his intentions, leaving the letter in the hands of the local publican for postage. When 2 days later, Morton came to Mount Sturgeon with a posse in pursuit of his stolen animals, the publican produced the unsent letter that expressed clearly that the duffers were taking them to Portland for sale. The posse now had a target and ended up intersecting the lawless trio at an inn in Fitzroy. They were arrested and sent to Portland to await trial. While awaiting trial, John Stewart escaped custody. Christie and Newton were not so lucky. So, despite a letter from Christie's stepfather asking Morton not to press charges, the complaint was upheld. It seems that the strain of the horses being driven so hard over such a journey had killed one of the mares and left the rest in such a state that it took them months to recover. So it's no surprise that Morton was in no mood for mercy on the men who were responsible. The two duffers were tried in Geelong, and on the 22nd of October 1850 were found guilty of horse theft and sentenced to 5 years hard labour on the roads. After a brief stint in Melbourne jail, the new Pentridge stockade was to be Christie's home while he worked on the road to Sydney when it opened in December that year. On the 26th of March 1851, Christie and half a dozen others would make a break for freedom. The men were guarded while at work by mounted Aboriginal troopers. Christie grabbed a rifle from one of the guards, who immediately took off on his horse out of fright, and the other convicts took the opportunity to escape. So obviously security was very tight in Pentridge at the time. Descriptions were published in the papers and the gazettes of the escapees. Christie, however, was not recaptured. In fact, he began to move around under the alias Frank Clark. But also a story began to circulate that his father was a Scotsman and his mother was an Aboriginal woman named Annie Clark. Possibly an invention by Christie to hide his true identity. This may have been given some air of authenticity by his naturally sallow complexion and dark wavy hair that led to his nickname, the Darkie. He was said to have spent much time around the goldfields of Bendigo before heading up into New South Wales. There was also a Francis Christie who was arrested at this time in connection with the infamous Mackay gold escort robbery in 1853, though some researchers dismiss this as being a case of two men around the same area at the same time with the same name who were unrelated. This Francis Christie was turned loose by investigators and seemingly vanished at about the same time that Frank Clark popped up heading Abercrombie Ranges. The law would eventually catch up with Christie, alias Clark, and he found himself in jail on Cockatoo Island. When he eventually gained his ticket of leave, he absconded and went by the name he is now best known by, Frank Gardner. Gardner had many robberies under his belt by the time he undertook his crowning achievement, the robbery of the Orange Gold Escort at Eugowra Rocks. He and his gang created a blockade and ambushed a gold escort, injuring 2 police officers and stealing around £6,000 worth of gold and cash. It was one of Australia's biggest ever gold heists. Afterwards, Gardner and his mistress escaped to Queensland, where they ran a pub, until Frank was captured by New South Wales troopers and extradited. He was sentenced to 32 years in jail, but was released in 1874 on the provision that he leave the colonies and never return. He would eventually die as a pauper in San Francisco. All right. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the kind of colourful characters that we're going to be looking at. Owen Suffolk is going to be one of the most interesting, I think, tonight, and hopefully you'll agree. So Owen Hargreaves Suffolk led a very eventful life prior to coming to Australia. He'd been a student at an English boarding school, worked as a cabin boy, fallen into vagrancy and become a con man. He was convicted for forgery in 1846 and was transported to Australia on the Joseph Soames as one of the infamous Pentridge. Convicts who were transported to the colonies from British prisons, despite such transportation of convicts having already officially ended. He arrived in Port Phillip on the 24th of September and was received at Geelong. In March 1849, he was convicted of horse theft and sent to the notorious prison on Cockatoo Island, where he remained until a transfer to Pentridge on Christmas Eve 1850. On 2nd of March 1851, he forged a pass to facilitate his absconding and took to the bush. Suffolk fell in with 2 other bushrangers, Christopher Christie Farrell and Harry Dowling, the former joining him in robbing the Portland mail coach on the 19th of May. Suffolk was sentenced to 10 years in hard labour for his part in 2 armed robberies, the first 3 to be served in irons. The sentence was mostly served at Melbourne Jail, during which time Suffolk was able to gain the trust of prison authorities as an informant, and he was given a bookmaking job. However, he used the position to secretly alter documents and shorten the sentences of his mates. It seems his forgeries were so well executed that he was kept in this role long term, and on the 28th of March 1853, the prison authorities received a letter from the sheriff notifying them that his sentence had been commuted to 5 years. Suffolk was referred to as the poet because, despite his criminal leanings, he was an accomplished writer of poetry, some of which was published in the Argus at the time, and even managed to compose a popular autobiography which was later released as a book, Days of Crime and Years of Suffering. On the 10th of September 1853, Suffolk received his ticket of leave and was discharged. He would not enjoy his liberty for long, as his tampering with the books was discovered in his absence, and on the 28th of February 1854, his ticket of leave was revoked and he was sent back to prison. When he eventually regained his ticket of leave just before Christmas in 1857, he was permitted to find employment in Ballarat, but he was unable to, turning to crime yet again. However, Suffolk was no ordinary criminal. In 1858, he faced court charge of taking a horse and gear and £2 in cash while pretending to be an undercover detective. In 1866, Suffolk was pardoned and almost immediately became involved in a forgery racket, but skipped town before the headquarters was raided by police. He returned to England, where he pretended to be a wealthy squatter and journalist, and conned a wealthy widow named Mary Elizabeth Phelps into marrying him to gain access to her fortune. He then faked his death by drowning and ran away to New York with his newfound fortune and his teenage niece, to whom he claimed to be married. In the late 1860s, he returned to Australia, where he was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for theft and bigamy. After this, he seems to disappear from the historical record. That gives you a bit of an idea of one of the more notorious figures associated with bushranging in this country, but one that's not necessarily as famous as some of his contemporaries and those who came after him. So Suffolk's story takes us through the period where Pentridge developed from a stockade to a fully fledged prison. Over the 1850s and 60s, bluestone cell blocks were constructed and the iconic gate and exterior wall were added. All convict labour, of course. With these changes came facilities such as a library and school, where inmates could learn the 3 Rs, workshops for a range of trades, and communal areas such as the mess hall. So I'll show you some of the photos from around about this time. So here we've got one of the buildings there, looking very ornate, sticking out of the ground there. And we've all seen this. Some of us probably drove past this on the way here tonight, in fact. So that's the main gate on Chance Street. This illustration was accompanying a newspaper report about the penal establishment at Pentridge. So this is the mess hall where they're all having dinner. Got prisoners there working in the tailor shop, spinning wool. And of course it's a wonderful place to take your kids on a sightseeing tour. Here we have the tailor shop. So obviously, yes, we've got prisoners sewing clothing and things like that, learning a trade. And this is the silence system. So, new inmates would serve the first few months under the silence system. They were not permitted to talk. The floors were carpeted to muffle the sound of movement. And when outside of their cells, prisoners wore calico hoods to hide their faces, and they communicated with their guards using only sign language. This was meant to create an environment for external stimulation in order to encourage introspection. It was believed that this could lead criminals to reflect and see the error of their ways, and so commit themselves to a life of virtue and reform. In theory, this worked well. In execution, not so much. That brings us to this chap, one of Pentridge's most notorious inmates, Henry Johnston, alias Harry Power. Power was born in Waterford in Ireland, but raised in Lancashire. He was transported to Van Diemen as a convict in 1842 for theft, and when he finished his sentence, he came up to the mainland where he picked up a job as a stockman and horse dealer. In 1855, Power gained into some strife near Geelong when mounted police questioned him about the ownership of some horses he was moving. Power insisted they were his, but a scuffle broke out and the troopers drew their sabres. Power responded by shooting and injuring one of the men. He was arrested and tried as Henry Johnston in Geelong, found guilty of horse theft and sentenced to 10 years hard labour to be served on the success hold at Williamstown. During this period of imprisonment, Power narrowly avoided execution for his part in a deadly mutiny, masterminded by the bushranger Captain Melville in October 1856. In 1862, he gained a ticket of leave and immediately absconded to try his luck on the diggings. By the following year, he'd been rearrested and sentenced to hard labour in Pentridge for horse stealing. So here's a picture of one of the guard towers overlooking where all the prison was there, around about the same time that Power was in there. Life in Pentridge was hard on Power, who was now middle-aged and suffering from various ailments, including bunions and a bowel stricture. This saw him often in the prison hospital, where on one occasion he attempted to escape by cutting a hole through the hospital floor with the intention of tunnelling out, but he was caught in the act. He was put on light duties, and his job was to collect the green waste from where the prisoners were clearing the land to make way for the perimeter wall of the prison near Merrick Creek, and he was then dumped on the mullock. This was where he figured out his next escape plan. On the 16th of February 1869, he hid himself under the mullock heap and got muster. Then, when nobody was around, he slipped out quietly through the gap in the wall and crossed the creek. He immediately took to the bush to try his luck as a highwayman. There we go. So he made a makeshift weapon, which was out of a pair of shears and a big stick, and was able to rob people on the highways and get his way up to the north. By the next day, he had become Power the Bushranger. The next few months saw Power covering vast territory and committing a considerable number of robberies, attracting a reward of £500. He briefly operated with a teenage sidekick, the nephew of some of the closest harbourers, but was not fond of the arrangement and reportedly abusing the boy frequently when in camp, prompting a split. More on this later. The reward money proved too tempting, and Harry was sold out by one of his harbourers, who directed police to his hideout. After days of travelling on foot in heavy rain with no provisions, police effected a dramatic capture, grabbing Power while he slept in his lean-to, then eating his rations while the old road complained loudly. Power was tried in Beechworth and soon found himself back in Pentridge to serve 15 years. So you can see this illustration here depicting the dramatic capture of one of Victoria's most notorious outlaws. So during his imprisonment, he was sent from Beechworth to Pentridge. During his imprisonment, Harry became belligerent and was frequently insubordinate. He was often punished for his minor offences, which included things like smoking when he wasn't supposed to be and starting fights with other inmates. During one of his many hospital stints, he was interviewed by an undercover journalist who called himself the Vagabond, and the report was then published in the press. The account was colourful and portrayed Power as something of a vainglorious raconteur. Upon his release in 1885, Power struggled to find his place in the world. He briefly worked as a tour guide on Success, which had been converted into a floating museum. After this, he faded into obscurity, and his remains were found in the Murray River, where it was assumed he accidentally drowned. So this photograph that we've got up here, the portrait, was taken just after his capture, having lived a rough life as a bushranger. So it gives you a good idea of what he looked like when he was out there on the roads. Bit of a rough fella. Alright. So around the time that Power was an inmate at Pentridge, another man who had already gained an infamous reputation was doing time there as well. Though his bushranging career was short and mostly came after his stint in prison, regular readers of the papers were very familiar with the man referred to as Captain Moonlight. There we go. So Andrew George Scott was born and raised in Rathfrland, Northern Ireland. His father was an Anglican minister and the family were reasonably well off. Andrew studied engineering prior to the family emigrating to New Zealand in the 1850s. Here Scott joined the army and fought in the Maori War, but was injured during battle, leading to a permanently deformed ankle that gave him a distinctive limp. After being discharged from the army for malingering, he headed to Australia and became a lay reader for the Anglican Church at Bacchus Marsh. After a successful stint here, Scott was transferred to the mining town of Mount Edgerton. In May 1869, the bank at Mount Edgerton was robbed by a mysterious man with a black mask who called himself Captain Moonlight, or so it would seem. According to the bank clerk, Ludwig Brun, he was bailed up in order to hand over all the cash and gold by the disguised man. He was then led to the school, where he was bound and forced to write a note, which the robber signed just before leaving. Brun would claim that the robber sounded just like Andrew Scott, but authorities were not convinced. Initially, Brun and the local school teacher Simpson were accused of committing the crime, but were released due to insufficient evidence. And so this here is the letter, which was written on a piece of paper that was torn out of one of the school ledgers. It reads, "I hereby certify that L.W. Brun has done everything within his power to withstand the intrusion and taking of money which was done with firearms. Signed, Captain Moonlight, sworn." Now at this time, Scott moved to New South Wales, where he led a hedonistic lifestyle. He wasted his money on alcohol and partying and was arrested after trying to buy a yacht with a bad cheque. This turn of events landed him in jail, and when he was released after 2 years, he was arrested again and extradited to Victoria. Thanks to new evidence, Scott was charged with robbing the bank in Mount Edgerton, and while in Ballarat awaiting trial, he and a group of other prisoners escaped from the jail. After weeks of bushranging, Scott was recaptured. He was tried before Sir Edmund Barry and sentenced to 10 years hard labour to be served in Pentridge. So here we've got an illustration that was done around that time of prisoners in Pentridge at school, writing and practising their handwriting on the slates there. It looks like one of the guys at the front is trying to cheat on the guy next to him. Here we go. So, it's fair to say that Scott was not a model inmate at Pentridge, finding himself frequently in trouble with the authorities, as his record will attest. He was often caught trading contraband, but it often seemed any excuse would do to get Scott in trouble. During his stay, he befriended a young man named James Nesbitt, who he would reconnect with on the outside. Nesbitt would occasionally find himself in trouble due to his interactions with Scott. On one occasion, he was called with a length of lead pipe and was accused of trying to use it to build a firearm. At the tribunal, Scott tried to use his engineering background to prove that he couldn't have been using it for such a purpose, as the material was insufficient. But he was still found guilty and punished. He attempted to raise awareness of the harsh treatment of prisoners in the prison by giving evidence at the trial of another prisoner named Wheatchurch, who had viciously attacked and wounded one of the warders with a weapon. He was promptly escorted out of the court when he tried to grandstand. By the end of his sentence, Scott had settled down and was able to get a slight remission on his sentence. So what we've got here is an extract from Andrew Scott's prison record. These are all of the things that he got into trouble for. So we've got things like talking when he shouldn't have been, insolence. We can see refusing to give up papers, disobedience in orders, having newspapers. So often he was smuggling in news, misconduct, having lots of things that he shouldn't have had, like coffee, idleness. So he was someone who didn't like being told what to do, very evidently. So on the outside, Scott began living with Nesbitt and decided to tour the colony to raise awareness of the harsh treatment of prisoners in Pentridge. He was interviewed by Marcus Clarke in an effort to gain support. As we know, Marcus Clarke wrote for the term of his natural life, which was instrumental in reshaping the way that people viewed convict transportation. Scott seemed to think this was a really good way to highlight his cause and associate it with Marcus Clarke's previous work. Now, when the authorities discovered this plan, they set about shutting it down wherever they could. This would be part of an increasing pattern of harassment that Scott was subjected to. Scott found himself frequently accused of and arrested over crimes he was not guilty of. This pushed him to cross the border into New South Wales. He was joined by Nesbitt and several other young men as they sought work. but ongoing harassment and lack of available jobs forced them into desperation and crime, culminating in them taking over a farmhouse in Wandabadgery near Gundagai. Resulting clashes with the police ended with 2 of the gang dead and the rest arrested. The constable who was injured in the fight would die shortly afterwards. Scott was sentenced to death over the constable's death and was hanged in Darlinghurst Jail in January 1880. So, there's some of the more notable figures that some of you may not have heard of before. What we're about to talk about is the one that you definitely have heard of. So we're going to look more at his formative years and how that pertains to why we're here tonight, rather than what he was most infamous for later in life. Edward Ned Kelly. Here we go. So we know he was born circa 1855-56, according to his records, but some estimates put him as being born as early as December 1854. His father was a former convict and his wife was, his mother was a free settler from Ireland, and he was raised in the colony of Victoria, up in Beveridge. When Ned was about 12 years old, his father died of dropsy following a battle with alcohol after a stint in prison over a stray calf he had taken possession of. The family moved to the township of Avenel, and then they moved to Greedy to be closer to Mrs. Kelly's family. Now it was at this time that Ned became under the influence of his wild uncles, who were the harbourers of Harry Power. It was through them that Ned became Power's lackey, holding horses during robberies and doing any other chores that Power demanded. Power was to give Ned some of the takings as payment, but there was never much to give. Power's explosive temper led to them splitting. They would later briefly reunite, but not for long. So it gives you an idea of kind of environment, the King River. One of the things that Harry allegedly taught Ned how to do was smoke a pipe, which his mum was not very happy about. When he was arrested on suspicion of being Power's mate, he was in a very bad state, very messy, covered in dirt and raggedy clothes. He was very lucky to avoid getting indicted and imprisoned over that. There were some issues with the evidence, so when it went to court, he was able to get off. Now, he's a bit older now. So, between 1869 and 1870, Ned found himself frequently in trouble with the law. He narrowly avoided jail for assaulting a Chinese man and landed his first prison stint for assaulting a hawker and his wife, who had accused him of stealing their horse to pull a rival out of a bog. Almost immediately after getting out, he was back in for receiving a stolen horse from a family friend named Wild Wright. For this, he was brutally beaten by local policemen and sent to jail for 3 years. His sentence began at Beechworth Jail, but he was transferred to Pentridge, and then the whole Sacramento and the barracks at Fort Gellibrand. It was common for the inmates to be sent to the Holts at this time, where they were employed in mending seawalls or doing labour around Fort Gellibrand, which is still a military installation, which I found out the hard way when I was taking photos and realised that there were army trucks that I didn't realise were going to be there. Ned was a mostly untroublesome prisoner, though in documents recently made public, we learned a bit more about what he was like. Okay. So these set of documents were released by the Prov only a few weeks ago. This is one of the medical certificates that was included in that, which was attached to his prison record. We learned from this that near the end of his sentence he actually managed to get a few days off work for having a tummy ache. So, you know, big bad bushranger has a problem with indigestion. Doesn't really hold up that romanticised image that we might have of Ned. So he was released in 1874, and after a period of honest living, he fell back into crime. So from stealing horses, he was involved in the wounding of a police constable at his mother's house, which led to him and his brother Dan hiding in the bush. The brothers, in company with their mates Joe Byrne and Steve Hart, ambushed a police camp in October of 1878, during which 3 police were shot and killed. The gang were then outlawed by Act of Parliament, following which they robbed banks at Euroa and Gibraltar. They murdered a suspected informant named Aaron Sherritt in Beechworth, and this was all part of a plan that would lead to the attempted derailment of the police special train at Glenrowan, which resulted in a long siege during which the outlaws battled while wearing homemade armour. During the siege, Ned was captured alive, but his companions were killed. After his capture, he was tried in Melbourne, sentenced to death for the murder of one of the police at Stringybarn Creek, and was hanged on the 11th of November 1880 at Melbourne Jail. And for those of you who weren't sure what Ned's armour looked like, there it is. So that was when it was on display in a recent exhibition at the State Library, and it's still there. It's got its own little room now. All right, so the Kelly outbreak, as it was called, was considered the end of bushranging in Australia. If you read most books that are sort of, history of Australian bushranging or whatever, that's where it ends. However, there were numerous instances of bushranging in Australia right up until the 1930s, including the cases of the Kniefs in Queensland and the Governors in New South Wales. In fact, you might even go so far as to say there are still bushrangers around today. There are some criminals that are still using the same modes of operation that the colonial era bandits did. Some examples of this, more recently, are the father-son duo of the Stockos and Malcolm Maiden. Although these are rare cases and certainly lack some of the romance of those outlaws of bygone eras. Pentridge Prison continued to operate until 1997 and had scores of infamous tales that unfolded within its walls in those intervening years. Among the more notable occurrences at Pentridge were the last legal executions in Australia, those of Jean Lee in 1951 and Ronald Ryan in 1967. The prison as it stands now has become a very different place. The prison as it stands now has become a very different place, a place to connect with the grim past, but also a vibrant community hub. It is somewhat amusing to consider how those who did time there all those decades ago would make of it now. And with that, we've come to the end of the presentation. So thank you all very much for your attention throughout all that. It's been fantastic. I'm happy to take any questions that people might have, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Yes?
You mentioned a few times about the romance of the Bushrangers. Is that something that we're putting on from this sort of viewpoint, like a lot of time afterwards? And at the time, was it romantic to have Bushrangers wandering around?
It's a very good question, and in some cases it definitely was at the time as well. Obviously since then we have a lot of romance about the colonial era, and we have these really great ideas of, the bushranger on a horse, the highwayman, all that kind of stuff, sort of an Australian Dick Turpin, or Jack Shepherd. But even in those times, there was a certain romance around certain bushrangers, particularly up here on the mainland. Certainly in Van Diemen's Land, where you had a lot of the convict bushrangers, there was a very different culture around it, because the background of why they were doing what they were doing was different. But, there was certainly, when we look at New South Wales, for example, where they had Ben Hall and Johnny Gilbert, and all those kind of guys that were performing just hundreds of robberies, speaking up everyone they possibly could, there was still even a little bit of that romance around them at the time. People were writing songs about them. People were making cartoons in the newspapers about how audacious they were. Certainly we know that with the Kellys, there was a very almost polar opposite perspective that you took. It's much the same as what you have now. Some people thought that, there was something really inspiring about what the Kellys were doing, because it was all tied in with the class war and stuff at the time. Whereas you had other people who were very pro-establishment, who thought the Kellys were the embodiment of everything that was wrong with society. So when we look at these sort of stories, it reflects the attitudes that society broadly has, depending on where people are from. We see in the 1830s with Jack Donahue, he was the wild colonial boy that they sang about. He was a violent criminal, but for the convict classes, the people who had come through that system had been on the receiving end of the cat o' nine tails, and were poorly treated by their masters. He was someone to look up to because he had broken out of the system. So when we look at these sort of stories, certainly there was an element of romance with them. Captain Moonlight was viewed very romantically in the press. In fact, he was viewed so romantically that the press actively made up stories about him. There are all these stories about him having fought in Garibaldi's army and having gone all the way out to the American Civil War to fight for the Union, and all this sort of stuff that never ever happened. It was just made up to try and make him seem more exciting and more romantic to the newspaper readers. So yeah, there definitely is evidence that people at the time viewed them with that same level of romance as what a lot of people nowadays do.
So were there a lot of bushrangers you actually sort of never heard of? I mean, was it common? So, I mean, we've heard of the famous ones. Was it actually a common activity?
Absolutely it was, absolutely. One of the things that I came across very quickly when I started my website, it started out as I wanted to cover all the sort of the main bushranger stories, Frank Gardner, Ned Kelly, that kind of stuff. And I very quickly realised that unlike what you got with the Wild West, where it was a period of about 20, 30 years of outlaws and lawmen, Australian bushranging history goes over 100 years. So it started with the first fleet. The first bushranger was a former African slave called Black Caesar. And so he came out in the first fleet, and within that period of time he became the first bushranger. After that, we had convict bolters in that first couple of decades, and there were dozens and dozens of them. We got to the gold rush, and we had another boom in bushranging because now we had people that were deliberately breaking the law because it was easier to steal money than to earn it. And then when we get into sort of the latter part of the 19th century, there was still lots of very minor cases of bushranging, and it was starting to fade out, but it wasn't until about the 1930s that it really had sort of been stamped out. There was actually a slight resurgence in the 1920s because you had a lot of young men who had missed out on going to the Great War, and they were reading stories about Ned Kelly and Ben Hall and thinking, I want to be like that, that sounds really exciting. And that was their way of trying to capture that glory that they missed out on going to the war. And so we had this uptick in what they called the boy bushrangers, because a lot of them were like 13, 14, 15 years old. And they weren't around for very long, but they were around long enough to cause all kinds of chaos. So yeah, we saw a lot of that over a long period of time, and being able to go in and find all these different stories, you realise that we only scratch the surface when we look at the main bushranger stories. So there's probably hundreds and hundreds of people out there who would be considered bushrangers that aren't necessarily remembered the way that someone like Ned Kelly is. Yes?
I have two questions actually. The first one is, I remember a movie that I used to really watch a lot when I was a child. It was called Robbery of the Arms.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things that you've spoken about, the different bushrangers, I'm remembering those stories from that movie. Was it a compilation of different events that happened for different bushrangers?
Absolutely it was. So T.A. Brown, who went under the alias of Rolf Boulderwood, he wrote Robbery Under Arms back in the 1800s when it was still contemporary. The character of Captain Starlight is what we call a composite character. He sort of pinched elements of different people. So the Captain Starlight moniker came from a bushranger named Frank Pearson, who was known for assuming different identities and basically being a con man. But the story of him stealing hundreds and hundreds of cattle and moving it overland was something that actually happened. It was a guy called Henry Bradford up in Queensland, and he stole, I think it was about 300 cattle, and moved them from Queensland down to South Australia. And that was the inspiration for the book. And all the different little incidents that you read about in the book are based on things that other bushrangers did. Other bushranger characters are sort of composites of bushrangers that were around the areas that Boulderwood was living in, including Daniel Morgan, who was even at that time viewed as one of the most horrible people who had ever lived. So when one of the characters is, the rival bushranger, who's real rough and nasty, that's who that was based on. So yeah, robbery under arms is a really good idea to look at if you want to get a feel for all the different kinds of bushranging tales, because it's all drawn from what was happening at that time.
My other question was, when I was in school back in the 1980s, bushrangers, that era of history was taught and discussed in schools. It's not something that's really discussed in schools anymore. Do you think it's it's in danger of disappearing, this element of Australia's history?
That's a very, very valid point. I think because my background is in teaching, worked as an integration aide for years, working with kids in secondary school, then I became an English teacher. And I was able to see sort of the cold faces of work, the way that the culture in schools was shifting. And obviously from a political standpoint, the push to sort of get Australian history out of our schools. And I do feel that we have lost a bit of that because of this push. It's one of the reasons why I do what I do, because kids love these stories. It really engages them in the history, and it's not just the crime element, it opens their eyes about so many other aspects of Australian society throughout history. And so I think that teaching this stuff in schools is a good way to engage the kids, but it's also very eye-opening. And the fact that it's not really being taught, like they might learn a little bit about Ned Kelly when they're in primary school, and even then, it's not always very accurate. It's not going to give them a very good oversight of any of it. I mean, I remember being in high school myself, and we were doing Australian history, and we did a little bit about the Great Depression, and we did a little bit about World War I, and that's about it. So there was a lot of emphasis on the Anzacs, and there was no real talk about the colonial history. Certainly no talk about the invasion and things like that. So yeah, I think not having that stuff in schools is horrible, because it means that we're losing a bit of these stories. The kids are not engaging with it the way that they really ought to be in order to understand why Australia is what it is. Because we learn so much about ourselves from these stories, and it's why we're all here. You know, it's not just the people, it's not just the events, it's not just the places, the buildings and things, it's the combination of it all. And if the kids don't have the stories to sort of connect with those things, then how are they ever going to learn about it? So, you know, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is getting it out there, getting kids exposed to it and getting them hooked. Because that's how I got into it. I went on a school camp in grade 6 to Beechworth, learned about Ned Kelly while I was doing that, and it was like a light bulb just switched on in my head. And I see it all the time. You know, I go up to Glenmore frequently for various reasons, and you see kids coming through, they go into the Kate's Cottage Museum, they go into the animated theatre, and even though, you know, they're sort of very broad and the animated theatre takes a lot of liberties with the history, it's presented in such a way that the kids go, wow, this is really exciting, and you hear them say, oh, I want to learn more about Ned. So if we can have more of that kind of stuff, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about bushrangers or whether we're talking about the colonists or the Indigenous history, if we've got these things that we can actually connect the kids to, it's going to make it so much more accessible for them, and it's going to keep that history alive, and it's going to keep the culture alive as well. So that's my inspiration anyway. So yeah, that's a very good point to bring up. Thank you. Yes.
Do you think Andrew George Scott was Captain Moonlight in that letter? Or?
That's a good question. Very good question, and no one has the answer to it.
Makes a good story.
It makes for a good story, absolutely. So basically, there was some discussion even at the time whether or not Scott was actually the guy. He was one of the first suspects. The police went and they knocked on his door, they showed him the note, and he said, oh, that looks like Simpson, the schoolmaster's handwriting. And so that's one of the reasons why he was charged with having been part of that robbery. Obviously, Simpson and Broome didn't want to get put in jail for robbing a bank, so they tried to deflect as much as they could, and it raised a lot of questions about what was going on. Scott maintained that he hadn't done it. Even when he was awaiting his execution, he said, I didn't do that, it had nothing to do with the robbery. However, he did leave Mount Edgerton just after the robbery with a cake of gold in his luggage. So, you know, there's a bit of a question there. He always maintained that Bruin had given him this cake of gold for safekeeping. And so he took it up to New South Wales with him. Not a very strong story. And then there's also the fact that, maybe all three of them were somehow involved and they tried to make Scott the fall guy. So without having any definitive answers, it's very hard to know. But when someone is so adamant that they weren't guilty of something, you have to question whether or not they might be telling the truth. And so that's one of the reasons why when we look at that part of the history, we don't have the full answers. Because Scott had a reputation for being very honest. Any time that he did something wrong, he would own up to it, because that was part of his Christian background. He was very, very entrenched in his values. And dishonesty and unmanliness was something that he detested above everything else. And even when we came to, when he was put on trial for the death of Constable Bowen at Wonderbattery, he always maintained, I didn't shoot him. I wasn't the person who pulled the trigger. And the forensic information that we have about what weapons we used backs that up. So we have to sort of question, is it possible that Scott was involved, but not in a way that he was conscious of? So he's got a very interesting story that the more layers you peel off, the more layers there are to peel back. So something I found is that the more I've looked into his story, the more there is to uncover. But even just the fact that, I had to leave out all the stuff about him going to Fiji and trying to buy an island and stuff like that, just because some of the stories attached to his life, even the ones that weren't made up, are just so bizarre. But it's one of the reasons why he's so fascinating. Did anyone else have any questions before we go to Bingle? Yes?
When did they come up with the word bushranger?
That is an excellent question. The first recorded use of the word was in about 1805. So we know that at that time people were using the term at the very least colloquially to describe criminals that were using the bush as a place of refuge. The term, as we know, we sort of think of a guy on a horse sticking up a mail coach. That didn't come about until the 1850s. The main reason being that you can't have highway robbery when there are no highways. So when we look at those early bushrangers, they were literally convicts that had escaped into the bush, or people that had, for whatever reason, had committed a crime and they were absconding. There are a number of cases of people who were free settlers who had racked up debts and they became bushrangers to try and escape getting in trouble for owing debts. So it was basically just descriptive of sort of saying, we've got criminals, but they're all hiding out in the wilderness where we can't get to them. So it was first recorded about 1805. It was probably in use way before then as well. Yes?
I think I read somewhere that at one point there was a ban on films about bushrangers in maybe the middle of the 20th century. Do you know if that's true, and if so, what was behind it?
I'm not sure. I'll have to double check that. Where did you come across that?
I just remember reading it somewhere, but apparently it destroyed the film industry here for a time. So
I actually, I think I know what you're talking about, the bushranger ban. So when our film industry started, back in the early days of the 20th century, one of the biggest things was bushranger movies. The first full-length feature film the world had ever produced, the story of the Kelly Gang, went for about 1.5 hours. We only got about 15 minutes of it left. But there was like 4 or 5 different Ned Kelly movies that were poured out at the same time, because they were only sort of shown in limited exhibition, a bit like a play. So they'd play the film for a little while, and then they'd destroy it because it was never going to be shown again. And so everyone was showing their own Ned Kelly films, and then we had the Ben Moore films and Dan Morgan films and Captain Moonlight films. And this went on for, probably about 10 years. And then the government decided that they didn't want that anymore because they were worried that it was going to inspire people to go committing crimes. So that argument has been around for a very long time. So they put in what was called the bushranger ban, which basically meant that, those films were no longer allowed to be made or distributed. And during that time, there was a huge impact on the Australian film industry, and we went from being a global player to sort of being a backwater in the industry. And when that lifted, that bushranger ban, we did get a little bit of an uptick because people were starting to make Ed Kelly films and stuff again, but we never really fully recovered until sort of that boom in the 1970s and 80s. So that might be what you were getting at there. Yeah, so bushranger films, they were a huge thing for a long time. People loved them, they thought they were exciting, they thought they were fun. And then the government stepped in and put the kibosh on that because it's, inappropriate. Interesting. Yes?
Were there bushrangers in other countries other than Australia?
Yes, there were. It wasn't a term that was used that frequently, but I'm aware that there were New Zealand bushrangers, and I believe there were bushrangers in China as well. So that term was used in other countries, although in America they use the term bushranger slightly differently. It's usually used as the same way, like a bushwhacker, someone who's a bit of a hillbilly. So it's not necessarily about bandits. But yeah, certainly the term did make its way around the world. Some of the bushrangers from Australia went over to New Zealand and sort of cross-pollinated, and I think that's part of the reason why the term picked up there. So yeah, there were definitely other bushrangers around, but we see a lot of that sort of behaviour in every society, don't we? Someone breaks the law, they don't want to get caught, so they go and they hide in the forest or they hide in the mountains. It's just that here in Australia we call it the bush.
Would it be fair to say that it's sort of the equivalent of American stories of the Wild West and outlaws and gangs and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's kind of an equivalent because of that frontier aspect. There's always been a strong romance in Australia about the frontier. You look back at Australian literature, there's a lot of themes that you come across about man versus nature. Is there anyone here read The Drover's Wife by Henry Lawson? Yeah, so that's a very good example of what we're talking about. Ostensibly, it's just a story about a woman who's at home in the bush with her kids and she has to kill a snake that's come out of the wood heap. But that sort of microcosm is reflecting the bigger issues and that isolation, the fact that the people were effectively at war with the environment because it was so hostile to them. I mean, when English settlers first came to Australia, they struggled because none of their tools were effective on the trees and on the soil. The first fleet, when they were trying to chop down trees, they found out that the iron bars and stuff blunted their instruments very, very quickly. So there was always this sense of, we're up against it. And so that romance of, fighting against the wilderness and the frontier is very similar to what they had in America with, the Bush West and all of the battles with the indigenous population and all of the issues around drought and, distance, the tyranny of distance, all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, bushrangers definitely fit in with that mythology, for sure.
Aidan, thank you so much for your talk. It was really fascinating. And I had no idea that we had our own hulks off the bay that convicts were put in as temporary prisons. I suppose it's a double-edged question. Do you know what's happened to any of those boats, or can you tell the ships? Because when I was at uni, you were kind of given the option of Australia was settled because we had too many people in prison on ships like that off the shores of England. So, do you know any references relating to these ships?
Yeah, I've come across a lot. No, that's a good one because I'm in the process of researching them more for a book that I'm trying to put together. So they were at Point Jellybrand in Williamstown, near where the Time Ball Tower is. In fact, the Time Ball Tower was put there because that was what told the guards what time it was when the convicts were at work. So basically there was a big copper ball on the top of this Bluestone tower, and when it got to a certain point, that was sort of the signal to go and have lunch or come back from work, that kind of thing. So off the shore there you had a whole bunch of ships that were painted bright yellow. They had their sails removed so they couldn't float away. So you had the President and the Success, which were the sort of high security ones. They had the most notorious reputation for cruelty to the prisoners. You had the Lysander, which was for Indigenous convicts as well as female convicts. And the Sacramento, which was the one that Ned did time on. So they were out there for a long period of time, and then they were sort of decommissioned in about 1890.
Is there a book that is the secondary source on?
There's a few floating around. Most of them are long out of print, which is one of the reasons why I'm working on it. Yes.
Just a heads up, yeah, I think it was a success. Ended up, she was made into a showboat with the convict, and she went through several hands and ended up in America.
That's right.
And she was requisitioned
Yeah, she
by the American Navy, and she ended up as a Second World War permanent. Second World War, though, so it's the ship that was.
Yeah, it's, it ended up catching on fire in Lake Erie.
Yeah.
And there's photos you can find online of the ship on fire. Apparently it still had a whole bunch of the museum stuff in there.
Yeah.
Because in one of the museums there, they've got all the wax heads from the sculptures that are on the boat and locks and stuff that have been dredged up from the lake. Success was the only one that wasn't completely scrapped. So basically the government went, well, we've got no use for these anymore. They were eventually turned into cargo ships, and then once they'd been cargo ships for a little while, they were completely disassembled for parts effectively. One of the anchors from one of the ships is still there near the Time Ball Tower in Williamstown. But there's not very much else there to sort of indicate what they were and where they were. Success was the only one that managed to survive because it was turned into a floating museum. And you can find lots of postcards and things floating around with pictures of people dressed up as convicts and, you know, all the exhibits they had. They added a lot of stuff that obviously didn't exist on the ship when it was being used for convicts. Things like an Iron Maiden, because they wanted that, you know, the Grand Union.
Iron Maiden is, well, I don't.
Well, an Iron Maiden you would have seen like the old horror movies. It's like a big casket with on the inside of the door is all the spikes, and so it was supposed to be a medieval torture instrument. It turned out that no one actually used an Iron Maiden, and certainly they didn't use it on the convicts in Hobson's Bay, but it made for very exciting things for people to look at. So that's why they added that sort of stuff. But in much the way that you've got like at Port Arthur, they sort of show what convict life was like, and sometimes they do reenactments where people get flogged. They would do that on the deck of the Success when it was being used as a museum. They had all the, you know, the convict irons and the whips and all that kind of stuff, and then yeah, went on tour around the world.
I don't think they flog people at Port Arthur even if they are.
Well, they don't often now. Sometimes they'll have like a special play that they put on to sort of show, you know, what happened there. I don't know if they've done it for a little while, but certainly one of the times I was there, they did it, and they sort of, to make it look like the person was getting lashed, they had the cat o' nine tails dipped in a bucket of red water, so that when they slapped them on the back of the marks, you know, that attention to detail always keeps people fascinated. But yeah, so it was very much that they wanted to sort of go into that whole the gory type of stuff. Because that was what kept people interested in going. And yeah, as I mentioned, Harry Powell was his tour guide there when he got out of prison, and he didn't much like it. So that's one of the reasons why he left before it went on tour. So yeah, you can imagine, you know, the amount of suffering that he would have had when he was on the ship as a convict, especially seeing as he was involved in the mutiny that took place there. Going back there as a tour guide would have brought up a lot of real unpleasant memories that he had from that period. But unfortunately, there's not really any remnants of the Success in Australia, as far as I'm aware. Just those, you know, pamphlets from when it was a museum and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was requisitioned in the American Navy. The Sacramento's, I think there's bits of her left somewhere, one of the company yards in Williamstown.
Yeah, there's illustrations you can find of, I think it's the Sacramento and the Lysander. They were beached there for a while, and then they just sort of, rotted away. Because we like looking after our history like that, don't we?
What about the Indigenous aspects to all the bushrangers?
It's a very interesting one, actually, to consider whether an Aboriginal person was a bushranger or a freedom fighter. Because in those very early days, the things that people said when they were Aboriginal bushrangers were the same things that other people say were part of those frontier wars.
The two first people to be hanged here were both bushrangers and freedom fighters.
That's
they were
it.
warned by Truganini to start something here or else you'd end up the same way.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that's credited to starting that pushback in Tasmania was a man named Mosquito, who was a New South Wales Aboriginal man who had been sent there as a convict. And when he had been told he was going to go back home and they didn't send him back, he escaped and he rounded up some of the Oyster Bay tribes and encouraged them to engage in warfare.
Well, they ultimately surrendered and welcomed him. They escorted him into the town because he had defeated them over, I don't know how many years it took. He broke them, he destroyed their economies to the point where they had to welcome him into the community to stop the carnage. Which is a very not good at that, because they usually take the head.
And that was a big thing. I mean, we saw that with Hemingway, didn't we?
Well, all get decapitated or mutilated, one way or another. The philologists get hold of them, or they're pickled or hung up in the there, like Truganini and
Exactly.
William May has his hands cut off, one of the guns, and the emotions never stop.
That trophy hunting aspect.
Never stopped. I hasn't stopped here. Yeah. About 2 days ago.
In terms of the bushranging aspect, I mean, we know that Jimmy Governor was considered a bushranger, mainly because the way that he went about it was the same kind of way that a lot of the white people would have done it. But there was a whole subtext to it in relation to how Indigenous people interacted with the white people and how they were treated.
Well, how Gilbert was supported without the support of his women. People all the same without was following money for them. They were never paid. They have the case. They weren't paid.
Okay, I think we've run out of time, but I'd like to, I'm sorry to cut in on that one, but it's getting rather late. So I should thank Aidan very much for coming tonight. I think probably the later discussion was very, very interesting to many people. And I'm giving you, on behalf of Coburg Historical Society, a bottle of our 50th anniversary wine, so we hope you enjoy it. And thank you so much for coming tonight.